In the name of the one and only. My being thinks the thought I claim to be. I am. Thus, I think being a transient reality, mirrored in the reflection of non-being. In the illusion of its perceptual nothingness, I question all realities, mine own included. All that is there could have been there without me being a part of it, as it will be when I am not an imagination, in the now of countless tomorrows. We are talking about the golden age of Al-Andalus, or Spain, and I must make a few disclaimers. One, the timing is of essence because ever since the Muslim community in New York City decided to have the Cordoba complex near Ground Zero, a whole campaign began against it, because here was an opportunity for the Muslims to show to the world a culture of inclusion, a culture of diversity, where religion was a secondary identity to an individual within a community. And the glory of Andalus, especially of Cordoba, was an excellent example. And this went counter to the momentum the Islamophobes were building up against Islam, equating it only and only to terrorism. And because of that, I think it's necessary to look into at least the sources in the internet for a whole host of disinformation and mythification of Al-Andalus, to discredit it so that their efforts to divide the world along religious fault lines will appear to be more valid and more relevant to the lifestyle of people in the 21st century than the lifestyle that people in Andalus achieved centuries ago, where we even today have not reached that level. The second controversy rose up when the government of Spain gave the right of return to the Jews of Spain, the Sephardic Jews. And when that happened, many of the Muslims from Andalus claimed that they had equal rights to return. And this became a controversy where the argument was made that the Jews really belonged there, but the Muslims had come to Spain as invaders, which is, if not totally false, at least 99.9% false. Which we will probably figure out by the end of the series, which is the next today's and the next two talks. There's also another myth in the way Muslims conceptualize what Islamic Spain was. So they usually sort of lump together like this was a monolithic, one whole state that didn't do anything wrong to anyone and everything was wonderful. I will speak through analogy again that if one were to ask you about, I think the majority here are Egyptians, if one were to ask to describe Egypt, an appropriate response would be, which Egypt? The Egypt of the Mamluks, the Egypt of the Fatimids, the Egypt of Muhammad Ali, or the Egypt of Nasser, and so on and so forth. We could even go as far back as the pharaohs. So just because there is one geographic entity, it does not mean that its social system, its political system was all uniform. And the same thing applies to Spain, because we are talking about more than 800 years of history. And again, the 800 is not a rounded up number out of convenience, but a valid historical argument. Let me start by saying that at the beginning of the Islamic history, there was the advent or the coming into power of the Umayyad dynasty. The Umayyads took pride in being an Arab empire. They were not really interested in Islam that much. And factually speaking, in the far fringes of the Umayyad Empire, they discouraged people to convert to Islam because that would have made a dent in their revenues, because they were charging more jizya from the non-Muslims than the optional zakat that Muslims would have paid to the state. So that is another misconception, that the Umayyad was, they called themselves the Khilafah, but they were far from Khilafah in the sense that they simply wanted to emulate the government, the style of government in the Sassanid Persia before them and in Byzantium. So they were acting more politically. So the expansion that you see on the screen of this vast empire is what Muslims take pride in, for right or for the wrong reason, that this is how Islam expanded, and where the non-Muslims condemn this, that Islam was spread by the sword. But the fact is that, yes, these empires were spread by the sword, but they had nothing to do with Islam. The people who claimed the empire happened to have an Islamic religion, but they were simply interested in establishing an empire, and that's it. So as the empire expanded, it was only out of necessity that the boundaries that happened to crisscross continents were irrelevant. Wherever they found weaker states adjacent to their own empires, they just went and invaded and occupied them, and that's a political reality that we see even today, or was it yesterday morning, and the weakness of Ukraine being manipulated by Russia. Then, of course, there is time for reform. So as you see in this map, the Abbasids come into power as a reformist, as a state that would adhere to the principles of Islam. So now this is Islamic, the orange part of it in the map. So they push out the corrupt or corrupted rulers of the Umayyad dynasty eastward and westward. And so the expansion of the Abbasids obviously come at the expense of the Umayyads. Well, the Abbasids were, as it was claimed in the name of an uncle of Prophet Abbas, the name is derived from that, so the expectations were that these would be really, that this would be an Islamic Khilafah in its true sense, not abusing the name Khilafah. But with all the flows and ebbs of history, there's a general cycle that it gets to a point where no matter how good a particular state or government is, it tends to become corrupt. So as you can see, the lines here expand further, giving you an outline of Iberia, Andalus, or Spain. So the green belt at the top is your timeline. We are moving from 711 to 1616. As I said earlier, that is the correct date of the period in which there were Muslims in Spain. I'm not measuring it by governments and emirates and empires. I'm measuring it by the existence of people confessing a particular faith. in a society, which in this case happens to be Iberia. So Tariq crossed into the Iberian Peninsula, and as you can see in this chart, at the upper left-hand corner, that is the smallest segment, the shortest time, even because it happened all roughly within 20 years, from 711 to 732. And 732 is the Battle of Tours. Sorry, and since these expansions happen mostly as conquests, as such, not necessarily as establishing a state, kind of state. We have these rulers, we have these commanders, not just Tariq alone, but Musa, his superior, who joined him later, and other commanders who moved into the north. And then from 756 to 929, that will be the Umayyad Emirate. Now remember, in the previous slide we showed you how the Abbasids were moving them out. Since the Abbasids claimed Khilafah, by definition the Umayyads could not claim Khilafah. So the Umayyad dynasty simply claimed themselves to be Amirs, and so they had the Imara. So we moved to 929, and in 929, when they become a little more confident, then they claim themselves as Khalifa, so it became Umayyad Khalifa or Khilafah. And this moves on until 1031. In 1031, there is a fragmentation, and it's also referred to as the catastrophe of the Andalus. We had one at the time of the Khilafah of Ali back in Kufa, and this will be the second one. And for the next 100 years, between 1031 and 1130, the states become fragmented, and I will explain in a little bit some of the causes that I have come to the conclusion to be the source of that. And then from 1130 to 1492, that long period is the slow decline, where the Muslim states one by one collapse, and the Christian states take over, and Muslims become subservient to them. And then from 1492 on, that is referred to as the aftermath. And the reason I'm using the term aftermath is that because most historians do not include that in the Islamic history. As I said earlier, they measure it only if there was a state. And of course, I'm talking about the society. Now, in the second and the third tier, I have placed some of the dynasties, and as you can see, they do overlap because Iberia or Al-Andalus or Spain was not just one unitary state that one government fell and the other one took over. They ruled in different parts of that. So the first one is again the Umayyad, and I've included both the Emirate and the Khilafah. And then of course, during the fragmentation period, the Almoravids take over from 1062 to 1147. And that's just a little short of a century. And halfway through, from 1120, the Almohads come to power, and that would be from 1120 to 1269. And then the last dynasty that was more indigenous to Spain is the Nasrids from 1228 to 1492. We covered the time, now we are moving to space, so we can analyze this layer by layer to put different concepts, ideas, dynasties, movements in the timeline and superimpose that whole thing on top of the geographic entity. So this is the southern or southwestern tip of the European continent, or more correctly, the Eurasian continent. After the fall of Rome in 418, the northern tribes, the Teutonics, the Germans, became more powerful, and they start raiding the south. So in other words, Northern Europeans were invading Southern Europe. So the Visigoths moved and they took over part of the Roman Empire, especially the southwestern, as you can see here in the map. Do pay attention to that yellow line, the Basques. And for those of you who may want to know, the Basques are the original indigenous Europeans before they were pushed out to the margins by the quote-unquote Caucasians. That is Tariq bin Ziyad on the current Gibraltar currency. He was a commander of the Umayyad dynasty. Now his action was prompted by what was going on in Iberia before, that the Visigoths were mistreating the indigenous people. And so once they moved south, they were considered invaders, but they are not referred to historically. That term is reserved only for the Muslims, but Spain had been invaded by the Visigoths, who were northerners. They came from a much farther distance than the Arabs of North Africa did, or the Berbers. Tariq bin Ziyad moves across the Rock of Gibraltar. Jabal Tariq is the Arabic name, the Rock of Tariq, which has been sort of Latinized, Romanized, Anglicized, and so we get Gibraltar today. And this is an aerial view. These would be the initial, let's call them conquest of Tariq. The yellow would be the Spanish territory, and of the Visigoths, and the green will be Tariq armies moving north. But this is, I've put the year 750. We do have to understand that the Arabs did move far beyond the Pyrenees into the southwestern part of modern France. But certain battles and exchange of fire resulted in them retreating somewhat. So by 750, this, which seems an expanded level of the territory if you look at it from the south, but from the Europeans, especially from the Frankish position, this is a retreated position. So the Muslim retreated back roughly to the border of the Pyrenees. I didn't explain Tariq's strategy in winning the battles of, just taking over the entire peninsula in 20 years. But when Tariq crossed the Straits of Gibraltar, his first act was to burn all the ships. And when all the ships were burned down, Tariq turned to them and says, "There's no way back. We only go north." And that made it kind of a desperate necessity for his soldiers to fight, because they had no other option. Go north to the Battle of Tours, the place where the X's are marked. And there, when Charles Martel moves, he finds that Abdurrahman's army had already taken most of the places. So what he does is that he takes his soldiers around the river bend, across the river, to the south of the river. And then he points to his soldiers like, back there's a river and we can't go back. So the only way is going south. And he finds that, just like what Tariq did, except in the reverse geographic order, what he does then is that he takes position in hilltop. And when Abdurrahman reaches the opening, Abdurrahman finds out that the only way to fight Charles Martel is to climb up the hill. And he knows that that is not the wise thing to do. So he waits for about 7 days, and there's no sign of distracting Charles Martel. And Charles Martel says, "I have all the time to wait, no problem." And what Abdurrahman does, again, a major mistake, is that his soldiers have come, like I told you, this had nothing to do with Islam, it was just conquest. whenever they took over cities and towns, they took the loot, and by this time they have brought a lot of quote-unquote that loot with them. So they are heavily loaded as far as what to carry with them, which makes their army heavy as far as the movement is concerned. But the other problem is that they have come from Spain, a land of warm climate. Their clothes are very light. Now it's October, it's getting cold, and Charles Martel's soldiers are well-clothed in warm clothes. They can tolerate the cold temperature, but Abdurrahman's soldiers can't. So there are many factors to analyze this militarily. And the thing that did them in was that Abdurrahman took the unwise decision of attacking the enemy uphill in a cold climate when his soldiers were not ready. And Charles Martel took advantage of getting in between them and attacking the wagons that were carrying the booties. And then Abdurrahman's soldiers run back to save them instead of saving themselves. And so the battle that they had won at one point, because the Arab horses were smaller and they could gallop straight up. So they had won the battle at one stage, and it was this unexpected U-turn for the booties that gave the Charles Martel's soldiers the courage to come back. That would remind those of you who have studied Islamic history of the Battle of Uhud. Same thing happened there. 756 is when relative stability returns, and that's when the Emirate of the Umayyads is established. And then we move on to 940. That's like a whole century and a half, in which time the map has changed this way, that the Christian kingdoms in the north are getting slowly but surely stronger and intruding into their territory. I don't know what "there" means, but using it only grammatically with no political implications. Now we are moving to 1036, and this is the time of the fitna, the catastrophe, the fragmentation, when small kingdoms are established. It's as important as it is to see the strength of the Christian states up further north. It's to see how the Muslim states down south got fragmented. And this was primarily due to leaderships that were challenged, and then if they could not defeat each other in battle, they simply drew a line and claimed a separate state. I think one of the Abdurrahmans, and there were many, when he died, his son who took over as a ruler was only 9 years old. So the commander of the armed forces, Al-Mansur, took over in his name. So this little child prince, who is supposed to be the ruler, is only sitting there in name, but Al-Mansur is doing terrible things to the Christian states in the north, invading these states, destroying churches, massacring people. And he was not an exception. The Christians did the same thing to the Muslims. But he being in the apparatus of the state and having all the power and having all the armies and the name, felt like he had a free hand. And this alienated a lot of the Christians. So, that might have speeded up the crisis. It's important to clarify the fact that there were Muslims in the non-Muslim states, and there were Christians in the Muslim states. In other words, simply claiming a state in the name of a religious leader did not necessarily meant to imply that the people in the majority were adherents, not necessarily. Here are the colors of the Taifa state. And if most of you who have studied Islamic history, in Islamic politics and history, there's a term, Malukut Tawaif, at the top, I put here. This term probably did not exist before. Taifa simply means a tribe or an ethnic group. Muluk or mulk would be the territory or the ruler of, and so the Taifa states are these states that are simply ethnocentric or tribal-centric. And when I mean tribal, I meant that the non-Christians that moved into the Iberian Peninsula consisted of Syrians, Moors, a whole lot of Moors, and Arabs and others. So they were not necessarily uniformly of any one particular ethnicity. In the midst of this state of fragmentation, we get the Al-Murabids. Those of you who want to know their Arabic name would be Al-Murabitun. And the very name of Al-Murabitun implies Rabita. Rabita also is connected to the word Rabat. Here goes my linguistic spiel. So what it implies is that those who stay connected. Rabats were the stations of caravanserais that connected one town with another, physically on the ground, geographically speaking. But Rabita is also the connection you could have in the course of time with your past. So in this case, as far as their ideology was concerned, they were trying to reconnect back. And the reason for that was that they saw this state being the result of people totally forgetting to be good believers, implying good Muslims. And since by the definition of the Almoravids, these people had forgotten as to who they were. They have become too greedy. They have become too interested in worldly matters. So therefore there is a need for a reinvention of the self in the spiritual term, and the recreation of the self in the religious term, and the redefinition of the self as being part of the Muslim Ummah. So this is a religious movement, a religious revivalist movement that keeps expanding. So if you look at this map, you see that this is primarily a North African state, and the southern part of Spain is only an extension of it. But we often see and perceive the Almoravids primarily as a Spanish dynasty. Far from it. These were Berbers, and they were from Africa. And when they saw the fragmentation of the Muslim states in the north, and those states were vulnerable, it's possible that they might have invited the Almoravids for their own defense against the Christian kingdoms in the north. All those possibilities exist in a more obvious way. So they simply expanded, and they took over where the Umayyads had failed. Sometimes when the momentum goes to the left or to the right, there is always somebody who comes and says, well, good but not good enough. You have gone far but not far enough. So if you thought these people were extremists of trying to kind of revert and convert people into quote-unquote true Islam, their own version. Then we move to Almohads. The Almohads also was another movement, a religious revival movement, and it started in the mountains of Marrakesh, same place. And they thought that not in terms of your daily affair of how you conducted yourself, quote-unquote, Islamically, but there were a lot of things that people did, they were too blended with non-Muslim cultures. So they were more puritanical, more extremist. And I don't know if I could throw a few words in here, like the Khawarij, or like the Taliban, or like the Wahhabis. Now, it's important to clarify that the movements started with all sincerity by very good men, knowledgeable, educated, with all the good intention. But once the founder dies, disappears, leaves the stage, It's the followers who try to interpret it and manipulate the crisis, the situation, the name of the movement in the way they want to. So the Almohad were a really religious, spiritual movement as far as the leader goes. But when it became political, it became a totally different story. And they became very, very strict. And as you can see here, they expanded into, throughout North Africa. They crossed into Spain. And when they went to Spain and they saw that people were, you know, kind of lax about their life, intermingling Muslims, Christians, Jews, and everyone, some of them thought that probably this was not Islamic enough, and so they had to make them Islamic. And so then they took over. As you can see, they kept expanding. And then comes the period of the Al-Andalus, which is, the Almohads are also, I mean, everything comes to an end, good or bad. And as you can see, the Christian kingdoms are moving further south and getting stronger. And as you can see here in the west, Portugal has come into existence. That didn't exist before. And that will be 1212 here. And now we are moving to 1265. And because the two kingdoms of Aragon and Castile united, that unity served them well, and they were able to push the Muslims further down, all the way down to Granada. And the state of Granada is the one that stayed the longest, and this was formed by primarily indigenous people within Spain. These were not Moors, these were not from North Africa, these were Spanish. And they turned into an agreement with their Christian neighbors of peaceful coexistence of sorts. Here I have a map of Granada that is presented more as an island. This is by Piri Reis, and have any of you heard that name? He's the greatest cartographer in the human history. If you think that this Western Hemisphere was named after Amerigo Vespucci, we don't have any of Amerigo's maps, but you could Google it, find out Peter Reis's maps. But if you superimpose his maps with the actual maps that we can take with satellite photos in the 21st century, there is very, very little deviation. He was a Turkish cartographer, and this is his rendition more in an idealistic term rather than a geographic one. We are moving to 1492, and that is, I think, basically the virtual reconquest or reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula. We might be moving to a different dimension. These are from Alhambra, and as you can see at the top, maybe you can't read it, but when the Muslims conquered, or the Arabs in general conquered any particular part of the peninsula, their theme was that God alone is the victor. It's not for us. And they etched this writing like all over the place. Every monument has that. Here in the middle of this beautiful mosaic, very clearly stated, "Wala ghalib illa Allah." This is the opposite side. This is the Fall of Granada, 1492, when Boabdil is sort of summoned by the Reyes Católicos, that would be Queen Isabel I and King Ferdinand II, 1 and 2 in that order also, standing on the right, and the Muslims are pretty much surrendering the state. So, but here, this is considered the victory of the kings, the power of the human, and in that sense. Whereas the Muslims, they might have been the victor, but they were more thinking in terms of a God-centric perspective. That's my take on the two. Now, when they take over, all the lines reverse. Now, let me explain what that means. When Arabs, Berbers, Muslims came to Iberia, they were known, they were accustomed to a cultural diversity in the Muslim states, in Baghdad, in Damascus. And so they were accommodating ethnic groups or religious minorities and others. There would have been a certain degree of hierarchy, which is inevitable, but people were not persecuted because they were different. They might have been taxed differently, yes, but they were not expelled. That because the state was more receptive of cultural diversity, people moved into Spain at the time, from all over Europe, if they could. Primarily if these were people who were, for one or another reason, persecuted. A lot of Jews moved from Northern Europe, from other parts of Europe, where obviously we know the historical reasons, that they had become targeted, and they had it good under the Muslim rule. Now, when there were no Muslims to guard these liberties, to protect this cultural diversity, and in fact, Isabel and Ferdinand had declared Spain as a Catholic state. And we, by mistake, often refer to, when we are talking about Muslim Spain, we think like an Islamic state. There was no such a thing. As I said that earlier, people who confessed to particular religion, and in this case Islamic religion, were basic politicians. But the Christians, and in this case Ferdinand and Isabel, they took over in the name of Jesus. They declared it as a Catholic state. The agreements was that if Boabdil surrenders his kingdom to the Christians, that he will be protected, and so would his people be allowed to keep their religion and their practices and all that. All they have to do is just surrender the political power. But the Pope was very persistent on this matter, finding very successful, victorious Christian rulers were pushing them that they better take care of all the Jews and the Muslims once and for all. And so they were pushing that the king and the queen, what is the term, rescind their agreement with the Muslims. Just as the Christians were taking over in the north, the most common activity or the most popular attainment was in the town and village squares that were taken over by Christians, is to see a whole group of Muslims brought in and converted into Christianity. And so this was fun. So every time they took a new town, they waited for a few days, and then they just blew the trumpet and said, we want all the Muslims and the Jews to come. Everybody has to be converted. Now, in this process then, a lot of Jews left, and a lot of Muslims left. But of course, most could not. And at one point, they say 77% of Spain was Muslim. And these were not Moors and Arabs that had come from across the sea. These were indigenous Spanish people. Now, as a result, that those who, quote-unquote, converted were called the Moriscos. Because ethnically they were Spanish, so they couldn't call them Moors. But they called them Moriscos, like Moorish, sort of. And the Jews were called by the name of Marranos. Anyone speaks Spanish? The pigs. The Jews who converted to Catholicism because they were forced to, okay? But even then, they were not done with them because they were stigmatized with that name. So Spain was Catholic, and there were the Marranos and the Moriscos. And then gets to this point where even those who had converted were not tolerated. And so it got to a point where they said they have to convert, confess, but since we don't trust them, they better leave. And that's when this decree was given in March of 1609. They were given time until July that they had to leave. And the conditions were, you cannot take gold and silver with you, which is something you can take, or you could take, right? Easy to carry. But you could take anything else. I mean, like your bed frame and whatever else, which you have to carry it across to Morocco. No UPS in those days. So in essence, they made it impossible for them. And very, very tragic situations happened. Some would be things like, the word went out that, oh, the people are swallowing their gold coins because they are not allowed to. So they are swallowing their coins. So when they will get to the port, there will be gangs of people going there with knives and, sorry to say, ripping people's stomach, looking for golds. So they were slaughtered right there. Then if they got into their boats to get across, there will be huge groups of pirates here and there waiting because, look, they have brought all their belongings with them. It's not a vacation trip, it's a one-way trip, like final sale thing, so that they have everything they own with them, so they would be robbed in the open seas. And it's at this point when Sultan Bayezid II of the Ottomans sends his whole navy to come and protect these primarily Jews. The Muslims were headed south, their destination was closed. As you can see here, most of the Jews went to lands that were either ruled by Muslims or had majority Muslim population. And we also have to look at it in the context of modern state of in the Middle East, is that before there was the state of Israel, the largest Jewish cities were all on the border towns between the Muslim states and the Christian states. Whether it was Rabat in Morocco, whether it was Tehran or Bukhara or Istanbul and so on and so on. The interesting thing is that when Muslims came to Spain, Spain was the backyard as far as Europe, especially the Roman Empire, was concerned. And the Muslims raised it to a superpower because all the talent was invited. All the people who knew whatever they could offer in science, in philosophy, in arts, in architecture and everything. But the point is that it raised Spain to the stand and stature of a superpower. There's a series called The City of Lights, PBS production, you should watch that, to see the contrast between Northern Europe and Southern Europe. Now, that's how they enriched Southern Europe, Sicily, parts of Italy, Spain. You see them here in yellow. Now we move a few centuries. This is today. This shows Europe's Muslim population. And as you can see, those very same countries that had become sort of superpowers because of the open political system under the Muslims are in the far right. Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Finland, Spain. Most of them are Catholic, most of them are in the south, most of them are the ones who had enjoyed a beautiful life under the Muslims, but they don't want Muslims. And I'm sure you've heard about the legislation in Italy and in some of these other states. Now in the far left, percentage-wise, France has the highest percentage of Muslims. That's where the Muslims were fought. Remember Martel. Those who resisted. Now, the economies of these countries in the north, that's where most of the Muslims are now. And I'm not saying that the Muslims are the pioneers of this economic growth. Of course, Europe was very progressive in the first place. But the point I want to make is that that they're at least receptive, they are tolerant. Now, one of the more tolerant ones is here also the Netherlands, which used to be part of Spain. and Spain was tolerant. That tolerance spilled over to the Netherlands. And for those of you who celebrate the Thanksgiving, where was the first Thanksgiving? Most of us think it happened in New England. The first Thanksgiving was in the Netherlands because they were tolerant. When the Puritans were kicked out of England, the only place, the safe haven they could find in Europe was the Netherlands. They went to the Netherlands, that's where they started their Thanksgiving. So first Thanksgiving started long before New England in the Netherlands. The only problem was that at some point they found that integration was a little difficult. Their children couldn't speak the language, and so when the opportunity arose that they could go to America, they made a U-turn from the Netherlands and came to America. And the tradition of Thanksgiving had already been established, accepting diversity, inviting strangers. This tradition is both in the Sukkot tradition of the Jews and as well as the Muslims, to kind of mingle with your neighbors, with the strangers, with wayfarers and all that. So those countries are at the forefront of tolerance. Now there is a negative trend, and that is, those of you have heard of the cartoons, the Danish cartoons. Well, that wasn't just the Danish cartoons against the Muslims. The Danes, for some reason, are a little too intolerant of people of different skin pigmentation. 25% of the Jewish population has left Denmark since 1997. It's a short time. And because most of them either end up in Israel or in the United States, we don't hear much about it, but there is that. Also, those of you, I analyze news usually from a very unusual, strange angles. The largest number of pilots who bombed Libya a few years back, Denmark and Norway. And we know the Scandinavians are the most, not only the most peaceful people around the world, but they're in the forefront from the days of Dag Hammarskjöld, the first Secretary General of the United Nations, to Galtung and others. They are pioneers, but at the forefront of the struggle for human dignity through diversity. And yet this trend is kind of simmering down at the bottom, which is something we have to worry about. Now, also it's important to note that, I mentioned the gold coins, but the Vatican was instrumental in encouraging the government, but the government's own operation was such that higher-ups in the bureaucracy of the Christian states in Spain wanted the Jews and the Muslims out so that they could have their lands and their homes. You know, when you were given only a few months, remember the Trail of Tears, when we Americans had to kick our natives from the eastern seaboard, okay? And when you could buy a cow for a few pennies, because otherwise you had to leave it for free anyways. So the same situation came up in Spain, and they wanted to encourage this so that the Muslims and the Jews could leave, so that the Christians who had the power could take over their property, virtually for free. And so it became more like a real estate grab, which in some ways is probably not too different from the situation in Israel today. Yeah, religious justification aside, there's always the factor of the land grab. Questions, please. Yes.
Okay, I see the opportunity from Spain asking for conversion before the end of your conversation was the Muslims could have taken that as a call to be patient and to let the Jews convert over to the Catholic or the what they were asked to do, and then in time those two entities would maybe understand that they could also move forward, keep moving forward, and hence the Islamic would gain people and power if they had that
It wasn't sequence that you first do this and then the other one. Whenever there was opportunity, they went from Muslims to Jews, from Jews to Muslims, back and forth. But here is the thing: if someone asked you what is the most popular name in the world, for men, for women, Maria. Muslims didn't feel offended if they had to convert, and every Muslim woman who lined up, when they were asked, okay, now you can't have your Arabic name or your Muslim name, your Quranic name, you have to choose a Christian name. What name do you think they chose? Maria. The Spanish culture is the only Christian Catholic culture which they would allow Jesus to be given as a name to their child. This also happened for all Muhammads became Jesus because they believed in Jesus too. But that is part of this forced conversion phenomenon. But I don't know if I answered your question. The point is that it was not sequenced, but they went back and forth, whichever was convenient for the situation.